Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Bateman House, and I am co-chair of the NYU Grossman School of Medicine Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access Working Group. And I am joined here with some of my colleagues today to answer your questions about perspectives on ethical and regulatory implications of recent events, which I know we've all been following. I want to thank Vaz Advisors for hosting us today. Our actual moderator is having some computer problems, so she may join us at some point. If not, we're going to do the best we can because this is 2020 and we're all doing the best we can. Let me just tell you very quickly about Vaz Advisors. It's a consulting firm solely focused on helping clients insert the perspective of patients through all aspects of drug discovery, development, and commercialization. And Vaz Advisors often works with companies in creating pre-approval access strategies, which is one of the reasons why we thought it was a good pairing to work with them today. So let's just dive into it. Let me introduce my panelists here, and then we'll get into the first question. So I have my co-chair for CUPA, which is the Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access Working Group here, Dr. Arthur Kaplan, who is my colleague at NYU Grossman School of Medicine, Division of Medical Ethics. So we have Art Kaplan. We also have Professor Christopher Robertson of Boston University and Mr. Ken Mock, who is a lifelong CEO of numerous biotech companies, who also was in the news with a very high profile pre-approval access case in Ken, I think it was about 2014, right?
6.5 years ago.
Yeah, so that's who we are. And we also have a colleague, Von Waldhauer from Vaz, who will be the one queuing up questions. So with that, let's get into it. I'll start us off and then Von can take over. So I think I'm going to start by asking Chris if he can just set the stage for us and sort of describe what are the key mechanisms for pre-approval drug access that we need to have in mind to even have this conversation today.
Sure, thanks. It's really great to be part of this. I'll talk about 5 of them, and let me first just name them, and then I'll say like 1 or 2 sentences about each one. So the first is clinical trials. The second is off-label access to drugs. The third is what's known as expanded access or compassionate use. The fourth is right to try, a new pathway in federal law. And finally, we have emergency use authorization provided by the FDA. So just a word about each one. Clinical trials are, of course, the starting point because that's how historically most patients have access to investigational drugs. And the purpose is, of course, primarily to produce knowledge about whether they really are safe and effective. For patients, the main disadvantage they worry about is they'll be randomized to a control group or a placebo. And so that's the perceived disadvantage of clinical trials for some patients. The second big pathway is off-label use, and we saw this with the drug hydroxychloroquine, which is approved for a different use, malaria, as well as lupus and others, but it can be pressed into service for a new use that's not proven safe and effective, like COVID treatment or prophylaxis. The third big area I mentioned, expanded access or compassionate use, is a pathway that's in federal law. It's been used for several decades. And there are various sub-pathways, whether group or individual. But this is primarily for patients that are unable to participate in a clinical trial, but they find a drug company who's willing to provide product, and the drug company, the doctor, and the patient together go to the FDA and say, we've got a plan. Can we get your nod on this? And the FDA approves the vast majority of those relatively quickly, sometimes with small modifications. The fourth approach is called right to try, and that's an actual statutory term. In my view, it's not actually a right because you can't get the drug necessarily, but this is similar to expanded access, except that it cuts out the role of the FDA and it cuts out the role of IRBs, institutional review boards, to provide that extra ethical check on the process. And then lastly, emergency use authorization is where the FDA can take an entire drug, an indication that has not yet been proven effective, but sort of press it into service and say, we have enough data to at least think it's promising, and we have this public health emergency declared by the Secretary of Health and Human Services that will allow, under specific conditions, the product to be rolled out onto the market. And as part of the emergency use authorization, the FDA can require some data collection or data sharing. But the big risk with all of these last four approaches, other than clinical trials, is that we don't necessarily learn rigorously about whether the drug is safe and effective. We're skipping right over that step to start using it clinically. So that's the big picture. Sorry to go so fast, but I guess that's the point. And I see Claudia has joined us.
Yes, I managed to get my computer up and running. Nothing like a little fun.
Hard to hear you, Claudia.
I hope you can hear me well. Better, Ken?
Yes.
Nothing like a little technical difficulty when
Spices up your morning.
ever, but we will not be deterred. We are so excited to be with this group today and really hope to focus on everyone's questions. This was great, Chris, because it really helps us get oriented. But if I can turn to Allison, why is there so much confusion regarding this terminology, and why is it so much wrong information out there about what these things actually mean?
Well, Claudia, I think that's the key question is, what is the sort of discrepancy between the really real that Chris just sort of described and the sort of perceptions of what people think? So, I mean, what is the root cause? I don't even want to speculate, but I will say that some of the terms are not incredibly intuitive, like expanded access. What exactly does that mean? And also expanded access is called different things in different countries. So if you have, a multinational pharmaceutical company, or if you have even a patient group that, perhaps a European patient group where you're spanning national borders, you're having to grapple with lots of different terms, not all of which are incredibly intuitive in terms of telling you what it is. That's one of the reasons why, as Coupa, we use the term pre-approval access. It just makes sense. We're talking about access to a drug before it's approved for marketing authorization. And then we sort of divide it into trial pre-approval access and non-trial pre-approval access. I think the other real source of confusion out there is a compassionate use, sort of the historical term that people used, has really been stretched to mean, access to something I want but I can't get. And that has been completely divorced from this sort of regulatory of is something approved or not. So if you look at for example, petitions through change.org or something where someone is seeking compassionate use, they might be seeking access to something that's in a trial and they are not eligible for the trial, or they might be seeking access for something that is approved and just their insurance company won't pay for it. So in terms of, regulatory definitions, those are incredibly different things, but they all share this sort of common, situation of a patient or a patient's family wanting to get access to something that is off limits. So, I think that we just sort of need to translate things into language that people are more familiar with of, you want access to something, you can't get it. Now let's figure out what the barrier is and then talk about the different routes that are available to you to pursue that. And, in the case of recent events, we've had any number of different examples. We've had people who want drugs that are not approved yet. We've had people who want, say, something like convalescent plasma, where it's freely available, but, you're not quite sure, well, how do I get that? Is that something that just any doctor can prescribe for me? Do I have to get it in a trial? Like, what do I have to do? So there's a lot of different things that have all been tied up in this, not simply because they share that common thread of, I want something and I'm not quite sure how to get it or if I even can.
Thank you. And I want to encourage everyone, this group has been answering my questions for a couple of decades now, and I want to encourage everyone to populate your questions in the Q&A function. We'll be answering them live. If we don't get to anything today, we will follow up on it, so please bring it on. And to pick up on what you said, Allison, is what we're seeing as a pandemic and professionalism. Several of us have spent many years with ALS.
Claudia?
Very hard to hear you.
You're fading out again. You're going to have to really yell at this thing.
And check your microphone at the end of this,
Can absolutely speak out. For some of us, or several of us on this call, who have been speaking to patients with ALS, with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, with other life-threatening diseases, and explained the importance of placebo-controlled studies, how do we justify that there is a completely different standard for access in the context of a pandemic? Is that appropriate?
And who got asked that?
I'm speaking to you, Art.
So I do think different conditions make it appropriate to make different things available. When you're dealing with ALS, it's a terminal condition, it's horrible, people want access and are willing to say, look, the risks to me of being in, say, expanded access or getting access outside of a trial are worth it. And I'm going to take it because I just have such a grim future. For some other, and there may be, in some instances, better animal data. There may be some experience building up that makes it look like this particular drug may be promising. For things having to do with children, say gene therapy, we try to be more careful because we know that there have been instances of harm associated with different types of gene therapy. And so you're watching the risk-benefit ratio and saying, look, we have to adhere to the clinical trial because we really have to figure out what's going on. And we don't really have good background information on animals, or we're so early in the trials we can't predict. In a pandemic, you may say, look, giving something to someone who is dying, we're going to try anything we can to rescue them. And that may be a situation where we're going to go after the compassionate use or appeal to the FDA to allow something to be used to rescue someone. And in other instances, people may say, look, we might go after emergency use and allow that authorization to happen because we're going to focus it in on a particular at-risk group, nursing home residents, nursing home workers, somebody who's in such a high risk of exposure that even though it would be useful to do a trial, and we're going to continue to try and do the trial, we're going to gamble differently because we have so many people getting infected with a high death rate, let's say in nursing homes. So the bottom line of what I'm saying is context matters, prior experience matters, level of danger and risk that the patient is experiencing matters, and you don't necessarily get the exact same answer for each particular agent or each particular experimental intervention. But at the end of the day, if I can just add, the clinical trial is the way to prove that we have something that's going to work for a large number of people in a safe manner. The emergency use authorization may turn out to help somebody on the spot, but we still often don't know whether that's going to work for everybody or whether it's going to be safe for everybody. And that is a tension, trying to make sure that we know just because the president seems to have recovered with 3 different drugs being given to him, and whether they interact or what the right dose is, who knows? Or did he get better? Because as some people do, they just fight the virus off and get better. If we don't do the trial, we'll never really understand which of the drugs he got might have helped him, or whether the drugs he got would help prevent the evolution of the disease in all kinds of people, children or people with underlying conditions, or people who've got a high viral dose as opposed to a low viral dose. So it's a tension, but in the long run, the clinical trial gives us the best answer. That's why so many of us on the call are committed to trying to do that route.
Fantastic. And I want to circle back to Chris from a question that came up. Lisa Kearns, another Cooper member, asks if off-label use is one way to access investigational drugs. And she missed the setup to the explanation. Can you talk about off-label for approved drugs? That's just a clarification she's looking for.
Great. So it's important to remember that the FDA doesn't approve drugs as such. What they actually approve is drug-disease combinations, which is called an indication. So they approve a particular dosage of a drug for a particular patient population for a particular disease, typically. And so in that sense, a drug, if it's going to be used for a different population or a different disease or a different dose, then it's being used what we call off-label. And that can be done, one distinctive feature, that can be done without FDA approval. Typically that's done in the discretion of the physician alone. Perhaps the pharmacist and the payer have a role as well. But that happens without additional FDA or even additional company oversight, typically. So it's true that off-label use pertains to approved drugs, but the point that I wanted to emphasize is they're not approved for this new purpose. And given the sort of history of COVID in the last 9 months, it's really important to see that was one of the main uses we had around hydroxychloroquine was technically an off-label use. But it presents really all the same ethical issues, because when you're using it off-label, you're not learning about whether it's actually safe and effective the way you would if you were doing an additional clinical trial for the new use. And it presents the same problems of informed consent for the patient, because they can't really know whether the product is likely to be safe and effective for them, again, because we haven't done those trials. So in that sense, off-label use is very similar and practically important in this context, even though you wouldn't consider that sort of drug an investigational product, but it needs to be investigated for the new use.
Thank you.
Claudia, can I just follow up on that for a second?
Please.
Because I actually think I've seen this confusion quite a bit out there, so I just want to underscore it. You know, when we normally talk about access to an investigational drug, we're normally talking about a drug that hasn't been approved for any use. But I think that, what Chris is getting to is at this moment in time where it's a pandemic, people said we need to get drug to patients as quickly as possible. One of the things they looked at were pre-existing drugs that were approved for some other indication and said, is there anything we can repurpose here? Because that's going to be a lot faster than bringing a new drug to market. So I think what we're talking about at this point is not, access to investigational drugs in terms of drugs that have never been approved for anything, but access to drugs that are unproven and investigational for that particular indication. So that's really where this off-label use comes in.
Yeah, and just from a pithy media standpoint, it's off-label use of an approved medicine and pre-approval access to an experimental or investigational medicine. I think those phrases alone encompass the full aspect of it. Off-label, it's already approved but used in a different area. Pre-approval access is experimental or investigational, not yet approved.
So if Ken was a CEO and he got a request to use his approved drug for COVID, he doesn't need to go through expanded access. He doesn't need to go through emergency use authorization. He doesn't even need to set up a clinical trial. He could just say, sure, it's out there on the market, use it as you want. But if he wants to be able to, really validate that use, then that's when he would need to do a clinical trial.
Fantastic. And I knew we were going to get this question. I think a lot of us have had to answer this question recently. How did President Trump go about getting non-approved drugs that are still in development? And I don't know who wants to tackle it. I suspect Art would love to kick us off.
Well, to tell you the truth, it isn't clear. The honest answer is, we think that his doctors made requests to the companies that supply these experimental agents. Some of them were already, I believe remdesivir is already approved for emergency use authorization.
Okay.
So he could get that if his doctors were able to secure it. Now, not everybody, even if a doctor says I want it, it doesn't mean there's enough of it around the country to send it to every request. I have a feeling there isn't, and I see Ken nodding, so I'm going to assume it's in limited supply. And I believe for his big dose of the Regeneron-made polyclonal antibody, not to get technical, but I think you got 8 grams, a very big dose of that substance. He would have had his doctors would have had to make an appeal to the company. That's not an approved drug. It's not authorized under anything. Now we're talking about what we keep referring to as compassionate use. The company has to say, okay. Then presumably they get an okay from the FDA and they get an okay from an IRB or Research Ethics Committee at Walter Reed in this case, where the president is, to use it. I don't know that those steps were all followed. You get the feeling when it comes to presidents that they don't get medicine the same way you and I do, so that, you know, if the president's doctors call up the head of Regeneron, then the vial or the UPS van is pulling up and getting it over there as quickly as possible. And also, remember, a little bit experimental here too, is he's being given multiple agents early. So it's highly experimental in that you've got an unapproved drug, the Regeneron antibodies. You've got remdesivir, which is available to the doctors if they can get it, making a request for supply. And I'm blocking, I guess you got steroids. One of
steroid, dexamethasone.
Eventually, yeah.
And that's around
the standard of care, though.
And that's pretty much around and used. We've learned that that's an approved use, if you will, of steroids for people with pulmonary disease. So the bottom line is what he could get relatively quickly, I'm not sure anybody on this call could get quite as fast.
Can I add something there, though? I don't think, and Art, you can step in because I think you wrote this, that any of us would object to the best available medical care, be it approved or unapproved medicines, being administered to a president. There's a difference, however, between that activity and drawing from it conclusions about medical care in general. So one of the lines I use is that the plural of anecdote is not data. That jumping from giving a gamish of medicine, some approved and some not, to an individual bioreactor called a human being, and drawing conclusions for the rest of the population of bioreactors, the rest of us human beings, is not a valid thing to do for anybody in any experimental medicine or any therapeutic treatment bundle, if you will, for a set of individuals. So the fact that that's happened is the issue I think we are most troubled by, not his receiving the medicines.
Yeah, Ken and I have tried to, when we've talked about this, Claudia, we distinguish between should the president get access to what the doctors caring for him believe is best for him. And I think politically, we all understand that presidents are going to get speedier access than uninsured people in a poor neighborhood. It's just the way of the world, and that's how it is. Or someone who's in a rural part of a state and they get sick and they go to a small hospital and they don't have the same understanding of what sorts of interventions might be out there. And that's just a reality, that there are differences in access. Maybe we should fix that. Maybe we should come up with a better system, but presidents do better in gaining access to expertise, going to Walter Reed, and in having doctors who know things that they think might help. That said, the fact that the president got better, and this is what Ken was saying, and I just want to reinforce it, doesn't prove that everybody should get the same 3-drug regimen, and that becomes a standard of care. There you have to keep testing, and hopefully we will. I know the president has come out and said he wants those antibodies for everybody, but that may not be something that works. Maybe it only works if you get it within 2 days of a diagnosis. Maybe it only works if you get 8 grams of it, but maybe it might work if you got 4 grams of it, and maybe not everybody can tolerate 8 grams of it. There's a lot of unknowns out there.
Understood. But Ken, coming back to you, as you were the CEO of a handful of companies working on life-threatening diseases. Where do you draw the line then? Do the president's children have the same access? Do other heads of state have the same access? How do you sit in that office and make those decisions?
Well, I think that's the key issue of expanded access, which is where are the lines drawn? So I have no trouble. I don't think any of us have any problem with an individual in the seat of the president receiving experimental medicines. But as Art just said, moving from that to a more generalized generalized statement that everybody should receive something when it is fundamentally unproven in a broader population is troubling, and it would be. I mean, look, another way of describing compassionate use or expanded access is not drug development. You're not running, as Chris mentioned before, the randomized clinical trials, which is really an experiment where you change one variable. One population receives X, and one population receives X plus your experimental medicine. You change one variable and you see if that variable changes outcomes. That's not expanded access. Expanded access is a series of, or collection of, one-off, if you will, treatments where you're not looking to test that hypothesis, but rather for immediate treatment. Even the definition, serious or life-threatening diseases, where you're just moving quickly. And certainly the pandemic is that. But now to say, well, which circle, this is just an ethical question, and I'll let my ethics colleagues answer that, of how big you draw that circle. I describe in the expanded access arena that there are no solid lines. If you, let's just take age as opposed to an inner circle in the White House, but if you say this drug, we're only going to give it to people who are 18 years of age or older under expanded access, and somebody who's 17 in 10 months comes to you, what do you say? And then if you say yes, then 17 in 8 months. You get the idea that all lines are kind of fuzzy in this area. It's not a absolute, but rather a series of questions. But you know, where you go in terms of administering a cocktail of approved and unapproved medicines to this individual bioreactor, it's not generalizable from that based on the history of science and history of medicine. It just doesn't work that way. And I think that's the issue we're addressing here.
Hey, Claudia, can I hop in and just push back on my colleagues, which, you know, I know they always appreciate when I do this.
Absolutely.
You know, so we've heard Art and Ken both say that they don't think anyone really has problems with the idea that the president would get preferential access to these investigational drugs. I do. I mean, I don't mean to deny that that's the way of the world. Powerful people tend to get access to the things that they want, but I don't think that's necessarily a good situation. And you know, whether I support it or not is sort of null and void. It's a done deal. But I do want to point out that there are some companies that have made principal stances of, we're not going to be evaluating who the requester is. We're not going to be trying to decide, does this person have more claim to this drug than this other person? We're going to put everyone in a lottery. So for example, we have Avexis, which is a gene therapy drug, where it's a global lottery. If you meet the medical criteria to go into their expanded access program, you go into the lottery, and who gets the drug is determined by lottery. There are other companies that have set up other, likewise, blinded request mechanisms. So, you know, it isn't a situation of us saying we think person X is more deserving than person Y. So, you know, I just want to put that out there. And the other thing I want to say real quick about the president situation is I saw a lot of sort of sense that, you know, well, the only reason that he even, you know, knew about this possibility is because he's the president and he has, you know, these great medical experts that the average person doesn't have access to. So I want to point out, according to the 21st Century Cures Act, which I believe was passed in 2016, Chris will correct me if I'm wrong on that, one of the components of that was that all companies, when they reach phase 2 of clinical trials, have to put a public statement out. Now, it doesn't say where. Most companies interpret that as meaning on their website, but there has to be a public statement of, here is our access policy. That policy can be, we don't do non-trial pre-approval access, but if they do non-trial pre-approval access, they have to say, here's the contact person to contact, here's how quickly you're going to get an answer back, and a couple other elements that are required by statute. And all of that information was available on the Regeneron website. And before it was subject to the EUA, also on Gilead's website for remdesivir. So I do think that there is certainly this discrepancy between the clinicians who are in the know and the clinicians who are not in the know. But I think that you know, in terms of statute, we have done as much as we can in terms of trying to make sure that that information is transparent.
Yeah, so rebuttal to the rebuttal. it is true that you could set up a policy including precedents and say, first stop for experimental drugs, the antibodies we're talking about here, is a random lottery, and you could get put into a trial. That is absolutely possible. And I want to do something funny in commenting on Allison's remarks by noting something that she points out frequently and that we forget. It isn't always compassionate to give you experimental drugs. They can go wrong, they could hurt you. It's a risk-benefit trade-off. Sometimes we assume that compassion means you get it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. You know, maybe the president was just darn lucky that the whole slew of things tossed into him didn't kill him. And so you're trying to weigh that as the president's doctors. I think in general, it's fair to say that when you're dealing with high profile people, doctors tend to want to be aggressive and hopeful and not deny something to somebody. And the president is a person who's a risk taker, and that would be his attitude. He said as much. So while I'm agreeing that you could, in a sense, hold everybody equal, there are companies, and Allison knows this, where we've set up systems for access to their drugs, where we've said everybody in the company, right up to the CEO, if they needed experimental access, would have to go through the same process, and the company has agreed. So it's not like you can't do it. It's just, as Ken and I were saying, when it comes to presidents, it's pretty tough.
Yeah. And remember that, Allison, you know, so there's experimental medicines, there's the Secret Service. We do things differently to protect the president. And look, sitting in the chair as a CEO in my Chimerix days, you know, the question we asked, and we went through this with regards to the Josh Hardy situation, was should politics or money or knowledge of physicians allow access to an experimental medicine versus not? And also there's the question of, and Art just mentioned this, that not all medicines work. In my particular experience, I think there's pretty good evidence the drug we were giving under expanded access saved a whole bunch of lives. But the clinical trial was not sufficient to get it approved. And in part, there was a mortality effect in certain patients, so against taking the drug. So not all experimental medicines received under expanded access have definitive benefit for the population on a population basis. There may be individual successes, but you know, if you save 100 people and kill 120, the 100 people are really happy, that 120 people are not. And I think that balance has to be learned. It's not something you intuitively know. And there are many cases where you learn over the course of time, like in breast cancer rescue therapy, which was popular 20, 30 years ago, that it's not the appropriate medical path. And we've lived that. So,
and let me also say there's a question in the Q&A, Claudia. Someone's just asking, have other celebrities or presidents or whatever gotten?
I wanted to pull that up and ask exactly about that. How does that normally happen? Because we know it does happen.
Well, you're talking about for remdesivir or the current drugs, or just in general?
Or other drugs and other
that's a life that I explicitly lived. Part of my story about my experience was there was a time where the phone rang, and leaving out names, it was a well-known billionaire calling on behalf of the father-in-law of a major ally head of state. So what do you say? And the answer is, if you say yes because of politics, or when senators called and they did, or friends called and said, I'm pleading with you to make an experimental medicine available to the child of one of my best friends, or somebody says, I'll give you money to make the medicine available. If you say yes to any of those, at least in theory, ethically, you can't say no to anything else. And I think those are individual decisions that CEOs and companies make and people make, but at least in theory, if you're saying yes for any one of these kind of off-target requests, it's hard to say, well, I said yes to that person, but I'm saying no to you. That is the basis of what Compact and what Coupa did with regards to some of its work with J&J and others, is setting up a framework which is agnostic to these pressures.
And I just want to push back a little bit on the comment about companies having a policy posted on their website. As just want to clarify that that often doesn't reflect an actual strategy. A part of what we do is actually work with companies to help them develop a strategy that is unique to their drug supply, the status of their development, the information that is available, and what is the population that may benefit from expanded access. So it can be different, and not all companies really put in the effort to make this an actual strategy. I wanted to loop Chris into this and say, is there an appropriate point that you think that companies should deliberately create and articulate a strategy in terms of the mechanisms they would consider for access? And is there a responsibility in reporting on those at all?
Yeah, I do think it is important to do this in advance rather than on your heels once the requests are already coming in the door. Because, you know, the two pathways, expanded access and right to try, you know, three things they have in common are that, first of all, that they only work when a physician and the drug maker agree to provide the product to the patient. So that's one reason that that right to try is a bit of a misnomer, because it really is, you know, right to ask your physician and right to ask the drug company to provide the product. The second thing they both have in common are the drug company is not supposed to be profiting directly from providing product. In some cases, they can recover what's considered direct costs under the statute, but even accounting for and figuring out what's a direct versus an indirect cost requires some advanced planning and some candor. And the third thing that they both have in common is typically insurance companies don't pay. So unlike clinical trials and unlike on-label use, insurance companies are generally not creating coverage for these things that are considered either experimental or not medically necessary. So this makes it a very tricky domain for a patient, a physician, a company to navigate to make sure that when they are providing product, they're first of all not doing harm to patients that present an unreasonable risk-benefit ratio. And this is especially difficult in the right to try context because you don't have the help of an IRB to make that determination. You don't have the help of the FDA to make that determination. You're really on your own in the right to try space. And second, to make sure that when you're providing the product, if you do, that you're doing so equitably, because poorer patients are generally not going to be able to do so. And I know Allison and others have done work around crowdsourcing, with crowdsourcing charity, which is you know, could be called begging on social media, is not a systematic solution to these problems.
Can I just add one thing? I think we should just put a nail in the coffin of right to try by saying that no company that I know of, and Allison and the team have been looking at this, no ethical company I know of will allow its experimental medicine to be given to a patient under right to try, where the basic premise is to go around the oversight of the FDA. Period, full stop, end of story.
Ironically, something that President Trump really likes to take credit.
I can't speak to the politics. I can only tell you that from the standpoint of the process and what this industry of people who are trying to save lives thinks, right to try was meaningless theater in that sense. Because if you're developing a new medicine, which is ultimately going to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration, would you really allow it to be used outside of the process of an oversight of the Food and Drug Administration? And the answer was always no. It continues to be no, and it will forever be no. So people who say they're getting a medicine under right to try either aren't, and we've seen some cases of that, or are taking an extraordinary risk with something that even the FDA wouldn't particularly be, you know, they shouldn't be happy receiving. And I think we should just put right to try into that bucket and leave it there.
Sure.
Claudia, may I say one more thing on the right to try topic?
Please.
So, you know, just for clarity's sake, Coupa has been tracking right to try ever since it was enacted some years ago. We have found somewhere in the order of 10 uses for it. All but one have been in oncology. They've all but one been for the same agent, which means it's just one company that is using this. And we have found no uses of it in COVID-19. So when people talk about right to try with regard to COVID-19, I think that to you know, harken back to what I was saying earlier about sort of the sort of metaphorical value of this, I think people are saying, you know, I should have the liberty to try whatever drug I want, regardless of who thinks that's a good idea or not, and not actually a regulatory pathway. So I just wanted to say that about right to try. I also wanted to go back to your statement about the public statements that companies put out with regard to non-trial pre-approval access, and how sometimes, they're not actually reflective of either much thought or the really real of what's happening on that company. And I would say absolutely that's true. And especially if you think about a company that has multiple products, they have one blanket statement on their website, but it doesn't say, for product X, we're going to handle it this way. For product Y, we're going to handle it this way. So there's certainly lots of nuance that never makes it into the public. And in some cases, that nuance has actually been fleshed out ahead of time, like Chris and the rest of us have advocated for it. And in some cases, it's just that the thought hasn't gone into that. But I will say one thing that you can find in those statements, not all the time, but not atypically, is a statement of whether they will use expanded access or right to try. And other than that one company that we have seen in the oncology space, I have not seen any companies say that they will use right to try. Just hearkening back to what Ken says about it, it's not perceived by companies as a competitive or a business advantage in any way to avoid the FDA.
Yes, you know of companies that have publicly denounced it as something that they would not. But can you talk about the expanded access experience in COVID-19, Allison? What has happened?
So I think I'd like to start with remdesivir, if we can all drag our minds back several months ago. Remdesivir, everyone thought it was the first drug that we saw on, being trialed that had the potential of being an effective treatment for COVID-19. And there was a frenzy of people trying to get access for it. I know, my phone rang off the hook, and I have nothing to do with Gilead. I was like, well, I can't do anything for you except for tell you how the access program works in theory. But what happened there that I think caused a lot of confusion is Gilead had what we call a single patient expanded access. So in this case, a single doctor reached out to the company on behalf of a single patient to find out if the company was willing and amenable to give access. And then that single request on behalf of that single patient was reviewed by the FDA and an IRB. That is not an efficient system when you are dealing with a large volume of requests. And Gilead, to its credit, recognized that. So what it did is it said, we're going to stop doing individual patient requests, except for, I think they allowed it for children and pregnant women. But otherwise, we're stopping this single patient request. And what we're going to do is we're going to move to a cohort program. Now, a cohort program to the outsider looks very much like a clinical trial. The difference is that it has very low inclusion and exclusion criteria so that the maximum number of people can get into it. And rather than collecting data as your main goal is to try to be providing access to these people who otherwise would be doing single patient request. So there was, I just remember, hysteria about the fact that the first drug that looked like it worked for COVID, they were shutting down expanded access. And it wasn't that they were shutting down expanded access, it was that they transitioned from a single patient program to a cohort program that was going to be much, less complicated and more streamlined. But I don't think the messaging went out very well about that.
And we have a question from Sukun Khan about whether other public figures have used expanded access as a means to receive access to a drug. I can't think of any examples where anyone has actually been public about that experience. It's normally done very much under the radar. Can anyone on the panel think of a publicly known case?
I'm sure there are, but names elude me.
Yeah. My knowledge is always that it's been extremely discreet, which,
I can say, as I said before, definitively that you do get those phone calls.
Yeah.
And as a CEO, I would get them, in the medical department would get them. So there's no doubt those happen. Whether they're public or not is a different story, but there's no doubt that occurs. And it occurs, the rules and one of the things that we need to be clear about is that the the framework of expanded access is evolving in terms of understanding of policies and procedures and approaches, and has been rapidly evolving for more than a decade. It certainly was accelerated by certain events, one of which we collectively went through as a group. And I think that that's allowed a better understanding of expanded access, where it's beneficial, what the risks are, and for companies to more clearly state their policies, as Allison was referring to, which again can be no, not at this time. Or for larger companies, remember that each drug is different, each approach to human beings is different, each regulatory division of the FDA is different. So this is a multi-linear equation of decision making, of timing and approach and patience, that has to be thought through, and stage of development. You know, for some drugs in some patient populations, after initial safety data, you might be inclined to make your experimental medicine available because of the need of the patients. And for others, you might wait until after a really good phase 3, when you know you have the drug works in the trial, but you haven't yet gotten it approved. That is still expanded access between the end of a phase 3 and approval, but you know that your drug has the characteristics you want it to have on safety and efficacy. So there's a lot of different aspects of timing. And the other thing we haven't talked about, and this was, you know, a risk that was taken very publicly by Regeneron, is you can give an experimental medicine to somebody and have something go wrong. And the public implications of that in terms of what happens if that drug really works. And if you'd run your clinical trial, you would have proven it. But now you've slowed down enrollment. You've seen somebody die under expanded access, and that happens. And your clinical trial is impacted in a negative way. So future patients now don't receive the medicine they might have received because you made this current decision. And that's another ethical dilemma that people deal with.
Absolutely.
And
Art, I wanted to bring you.
Just to put an ethics point on it, what we're asking, I think what's being asked about celebrities and high visibility people, and even people who fundraise on GoFundMe or mount PR campaigns, is the system completely fair? And the answer is no. There are some judgments that CEOs are going to make, and some will say, yeah, if you send me money, I'll get you the drug, or yes, you're a friend of mine from the golf club that came up with Regeneron. Did the president know the CEO of Regeneron, and da-da-da-da. But I don't think any of us should be shocked. We may not like it, but we shouldn't be shocked that the system isn't totally fair.
But Art, I wanted to talk a little bit about the vaccine space, and what if you could talk a little bit about the vaccine mini commissions.
Well, there are many groups looking at early approval for a vaccine, and the president has been insistent that a vaccine will appear soon. Others have pointed out that we still don't have enough data yet to safely get a vaccine approved. We've had a couple of pauses in the clinical trials. We're in the clinical trial space now of testing vaccines, and these pauses, I think, are somewhat to be expected. If you test an experimental vaccine on 60,000 people, it's pretty likely that somebody will have an untoward event, and you want to figure out, were they in the placebo group when they had it, in which case it doesn't harm the vaccine, or if they did have some sort of an untoward event and they're in the vaccine group, is it because of the vaccine or is it something else? And that can be hard to figure out, so that's why it takes time to analyze these events. But in any event, the data coming out of these tests of Moderna, Johnson & Johnson's vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, many others, are not yet sufficient to say that we really know that the vaccine is safe and effective. Hopefully we'll start getting that kind of data, the completed data, maybe by the end of the year, maybe by January, and so that would help. But to get something approved early, the White House has been trying to push FDA to say, don't worry about getting the data on the whole thing. Maybe we can get an early approval on partial data. That's inappropriate. And the FDA rightly, and I think bravely, has fought back and said, no, we're not going to do an early licensure and early approval of the product until we have sufficient data like we would expect for any vaccine. Why? Because you don't want to vaccinate 330 million Americans and then have a bunch of safety issues. Sometimes I have to remind people, you can have a vaccine approved if people are nervous about it, don't trust it, think it was rushed. It doesn't do us any good because they won't take it, right? So we want to have confidence. Vaccines have troubles historically with trust and confidence, and the more data we've got to be able to go out to the public and say, nope, we studied everybody thoroughly, we didn't cut corners, we didn't rush it. All that said, last comment on emergency approval. We could decide that there are people at such high risk, and I mentioned this earlier in some of my remarks, people who are working in nursing homes, people who are working in meatpacking plants or some of the reservations in the US where we've had big outbreaks and a lot of deaths, that we might give emergency use authorization to a vaccine for a particular group. That might make sense if the risks that that group faced were so huge. It's not the same as saying we're going to use partial data to license the vaccine or get the vaccine approved for everybody. But I could imagine somebody saying, let's approve it for some subpopulation. And that historically is how emergency use authorization has been used for vaccines, not for a shortcut to get it out there for everybody, but as a way to get it to some people. Remember anthrax and people trying to use vaccines, fearful of anthrax attacks and so on, maybe for some people at very high risk. So hopefully that makes sense. I don't think we should be rushing approval of vaccines. You're going to undermine trust. Anti-vaccine people who don't like vaccines generally will have a field day with a sped up approval on a vaccine. And I think the companies themselves know that their liability, their reputation depends on not putting out a vaccine product that the whole world is watching without adequate data.
Yeah.
We're talking about taking an experimental, in this case, vaccine tested in 30,000 individual bioreactors called human beings, and now going to 300 million or several billion. And I think that we just need to be aware of the safety and efficacy risks, and that if that barrier of safety and efficacy sanctity is crossed, they'll be held to pay.
I just emphasize that it really isn't a game of numbers, and not trivializing using the word a game, but most investigational products will fail to be shown safe and effective. So we really have to worry about sort of optimism bias and letting our hopes govern our reasonable beliefs. Most of these products will end up being unsafe and ineffective. And so that's the world we're playing in. So that's why clinical trials are the way to go.
And Chris, is there an opportunity for us to, given all this attention, to expand the public's knowledge, to increase health literacy, because these topics have been so much in the headlines these days?
I love any possibility of thinking that something positive has come out of the pandemic. And maybe that's actually one, is now people are at least starting to think about, the FDA approval process. At the very least, they now know more than they did. Whether the net of that knowledge is helpful or not, I don't know, given the misinformation that's out there about the process. But at least this is, raised the question.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and say, I think the whole area, despite our efforts in this hour, is tough. There's a lot of pathways, a lot going on, a lot of balls in the air. What I hope is that people come away perhaps understanding better, why is the FDA role so important? It's trying to protect all of us. It's not trying to hinder the ALS patient or get in the way of our being able to go back to work and school through the pandemic. It's trying to make sure that we don't put, as Chris just said, our hopes first and roll out something that is just not going to be safe for huge numbers of people. Even as Ken said, with the 30,000 studies, actually, I think Janssen has 60,000.
60,000, correct, yeah.
That's still a tiny number relative to the world. So I hope,
if we don't have faith in the process, as I think that's what we're touching on, and the confusion that's been created is far from helpful. There's awareness, but there's confusion, and I think that we're going to have to see some re-sanctification of some of our institutions, so that people get comfortable with that. Because again, people have come to expect that medicines are safe. Nobody reads the side effect profile in detail, and that's another whole problem that we should address in some way. Would you lose weight, or would you take a pill? I'll take a pill. What happens if the pill has a side effect? Well, that's, so when we talk about expanded access, which is even earlier in the process, we're dealing with this, multiple times over. And that's another whole issue. But the concept that you can will your way to an approval is a dangerous one.
I want to give everyone an opportunity to make a closing remark, but I wanted to start by thanking everyone for joining us today. It was an impromptu process of putting this together because we really felt that this conversation was extremely important. And I'm so glad that I think everyone got a real taste of a Coupa meeting. This is what we do. We just kind of go at each other with all these different concepts with a complete focus on all different strategies to support pre-approval drug access that does lead to information that can support a greater good. I also want to thank the team at Vaz for turning around on a dime and making this happen. Sage at NYU for supporting us. You are all wonderful. And just want to emphasize that this is an ongoing conversation, that we are available, that we will chase answers for you. This is what we do best, is chase for really the best answers. So turning around and just asking Ken, since you're on the screen, any closing thoughts that you want to make sure that get across?
There's a lot of confusion right now. I think the pathways we've discussed are all pretty clear. One of those pathways, right to try, really shouldn't exist, but expanded access is designed to help patients with serious or life-threatening diseases. And the question is who and when and how. And we've seen a little bit of blurring, which has made it, on the one hand, increased awareness, but made it more difficult. There are different choices for different medicines. We touched on that before. And each medicine is different in its developmental pathway, experimental medicine. And we just need to be aware of that. But safety and efficacy have to be understood.
Absolutely. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I think that's the bottom line. I guess one of the things I'd mention in terms of a detail is about when bad things happen, and bad things do happen. We've seen clinical trials paused due to data safety monitoring. Those same sorts of things happen, if not more often, in expanded access and right to try, because the patient population is often less well defined than in a clinical trial with narrow inclusion and exclusion criteria. The one thing that's really, I think, important in this space for a company to consider is transparency about those outcomes. There's been some talk about right to try allows you to hide the bad outcomes, or allows you to not tell the FDA for a year, or but the bottom line is there's lots of reasons why transparency is important. Not the least is securities fraud, actually, is another sort of from the side limitation for companies to consider. So thank goodness we're getting some degree of transparency, but right now a major push is to get the FDA to be more transparent, and HHS, about the trial designs that are now going on. So when we start getting that data rolling out, the experts in trial design will already be able to say what are the strengths and weaknesses and can we trust it or not. I think that's really what's at stake in this healthcare new product space, is whether the public and individual patients can trust the products they're putting into their own bodies. And that's a profound trust indeed.
Fantastic. Allison, 30 seconds.
Regardless of what pathway you're looking at access to investigational medicines, there are multiple stakeholders involved. There are patient advocacy groups, clinicians, companies, regulators, and they all have a role to play. So be thinking about what it is that your role is. And if you have questions, we're here. Contact us.
And Art.
Yeah, I just say, I think we've seen the importance, despite panic and pressure and a pandemic that's crushing the global economy and so on. We've got to stay tough in terms of keeping the regulatory process in place. It's served us well. It's prevented bad drugs and vaccines from getting out there. And I think pressure on the system to speed up, despite the misery of a plague, we've got to try and hold the line to make sure we get adequate data before we do something like vaccinate the world with something that people won't trust or turns out to be dangerous.
Thank you. And a final thank you to you, Art, and Allison, Chris, Ken, for always being so wonderfully generous. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope this was helpful. We look forward to answering any other questions that you may have. Take care.